Madhava Indra Bihari. Gopijana Balaba Girivardhari. Gopijana Balaba Girivardhari. Yashoda Nandan Vrajajana Ranjana. Yashoda Nandana Vrajajana Ranjana. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Jaya Radha Madhava Indra Bihari. Jaya Radha Madhava Indra Bihari. Radha Madhava Indra Bihari. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivajrakacharya Astachara Śrimad Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki. ISKCON Founder Acharya Srila Prabhupada Ki. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivajrakacharya Astachara Śrimad Divine Grace Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj Prabhupada Ki. Ananta Koti Vaishnavanda Ki. Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki. Prem Sukho Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Sri Vasadi Gaurabhaktivinoda Ki. Sri Sri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinath Shamakunda Radha Kunda Girgovardhan Ki. Vrindavan Dham Ki. Navadvip Mayapur Dham Ki. Jagannath Puri Dham Ki. Gangamaya Ki. Yamunamaya Ki. Tulasi Devi Ki. Bhakti Devi Ki. Samaveda Bhaktivinoda Ki. Gaura Premanandi. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Shishi, Guru, and Gauranga. So we're reading from the Śrimad Bhāgavatam, Canto 3, which is entitled The Status Quo. And we're on chapter 16, which is entitled The Two Doorkeepers of Vaikuntha, Jai and Vijay, Cursed by the Sages. I believe we're supposed to do 18 yesterday, so we should be on 19 today. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Taranti Hi Anjasa Mrityum Niritaha Yat Anugrahat Yoginaha Saha Bhavan Kim Sit Anugrayeta Yat Parahi Taranti Yanjasa Mrityum Nirvita Yadanugrahat Yoginasa Bhavan Kimasid Anugrayeta Yat Parai Turanti yanjasa mrityum Nivritayad anugrahat Yoginasa bhavan kim svid Anugrayeta yat parai Turanti yanjasa mrityum Nivritayad anugrahat Yoginasa bhavan kim svid Anugrayeta yat parai Turantanja samrityum Nivritayad anugrahat Yoginasa bhavan kim svid Anugrayeta yat parai Turanti yanja samrityum Nivritayad anugrahat Yogina sabhabham kinsid Anugreta yat parai Turanti yana samrityum Do you want to chant? Granti yanja samrityum Vitayad anugraha Yogina sambhavam kinsid Anugreta yat palai Taranti cross over. Okay. Cross over. He, because Anjasa, easily, Mrityum, birth and death, Nirvitaha, ceasing all material desires, Yat, your, Anugrahat, by mercy, Yoginaha, transcendentalists, Saha, the Supreme Lord, Bhavan, you, came as fit, never possible, Anugreta, may be favored, Yat, which, Parahi, by others. Translation: mystics and transcendentalists, by the mercy of the Lord, cross beyond nescience by ceasing all material desires. It is not possible, therefore, that the Supreme Lord can be favored by others. Please repeat. Mystics and transcendentalists, by the mercy of the Lord, cross beyond nations by ceasing all material desires. It is not possible, therefore, that the Supreme Lord can be favored by others. Hare Krishna. So, Hari Bhakti didn't show up, so sorry, I've lost. Sorry. So, did you want to give class? Okay, just checking. I know you're giving class tomorrow, so yeah, I'm standing, just checking. Oh no, I mean he can do mine. I do next Wednesday, so he can have my Wednesday if he wants. Purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. We're on 19 today. Unless one is favored by the Supreme Lord, one cannot cross over the ocean of nescience, of repeated birth and death. Here it is stated that yogis or mystics cross beyond nescience by the mercy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. There are many kinds of mystics, such as the Karma Yogi, Jnana Yogi, Jnana Yogi, and Bhakti Yogi. The Karmis particularly search after the favor of the demigods. The Jnanis want to become one with the Supreme Absolute Truth. And the Yogis are satisfied simply by partial vision of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Paramatma, and ultimately by oneness with Him. But the Bhaktas, the devotees, want to associate with the Supreme Personality of Godhead eternally and serve Him. It's already been admitted that the Lord is eternal, and those who want the favor of the Supreme Lord perpetually are also eternal. Therefore, yogis here means devotees. By the mercy of the Lord, devotees can easily pass beyond the nescience of birth and death and attain the eternal abode of the Lord. The Lord is therefore not in need of another's favor, because no one is equal to or greater than Him. Actually, everyone needs the favor of the Lord for a successful understanding of His human mission. Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasaya Budale Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Kachayani Namaste Shrimati Pastata Vishnu Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Bhuvanityand Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhaktivinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Kalpata Bishta Kripa Sinimcha Titanam Padam Vaishnavi Bhivanamana. So, Srila Prabhupada starts out the purport. Unless one is favored by the Supreme Lord, one cannot cross over the nescience of repeated birth and death. So that's a fact. One of the names of Krishna is Mukunda, or He who gives liberation. And the demigods, they can't by themselves give the benediction of liberation. They can only advise one, engage in the service of the Lord, Hari, who gives liberation. Actually, not only can we cross beyond birth and death, but there's a nice verse in the Gita where Krishna says that we can cross all the obstacles of material life. It's Bhagavad Gita 18:58, which is Pachita Sarva Durgani Mat Prasadat Tarishisi Adachatvam Ahankaram Nashrosasi Vinangshasi. If you become conscious of me, you will pass over all the obstacles of conditioned life by my grace. If you do not work in such consciousness, but act through false ego, not hearing me, you will be lost. So then Prabhupada talks about the different kinds of mystics and how they have different conceptions of what the goal is, and different ways for achieving the goal. He mentions the karmis who seek after the favor of the demigods. So the people who grow up in the Vedic culture, they understand that there's these beings greater than human beings and less than God, that have superhuman abilities, and they can give rather than working hard to achieve some goal, they can just worship the demigod and get that goal in a lot easier way. So they do that, but they don't actually understand. Karmis don't actually understand that there's an eternal spiritual situation, and therefore they just try to find the best material situation, and that is in heaven. So they try to worship the demigods, and as Krishna says, those who worship the demigods, they go to the planets of the demigods, so they can go to the heavenly planets. But Krishna deprecates that because they can only enjoy so long in the heavenly planets, and then their piety runs out and they come back here. So those who follow the principles of the three Vedas, they achieve only repeated birth and death. So Krishna doesn't recommend that. And he talks about the jnanis who want to become one with the absolute truth. So it describes that process as neti, separating what is eternal from what is temporary, and absorbing oneself in the eternal. But by that process, one can't actually come to the personal form of the Lord, which is beyond material conception. One can only understand the Brahman feature, the all-pervading spirit, which underlies every material manifestation. So, it's described the absolute truth has three features. Vedanti tattva vidas tattvam yajgyanam advayam brahmeti paramatmeti bhagavaniti shabhyate. The learned transcendentalists, they know the absolute truth is that non-dual substance, which is Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. So by the process of jnana yoga, they can come in touch with the Brahman feature, and by meditation, the yogis can come in touch with the Paramatma feature. But it's described that only the bhaktas come in touch with the personal feature, Bhagavan. And Bhagavan is he who has an eternal abode in the spiritual world. And the yogis, they sometimes make different mistakes. When they see the Paramatma in the heart, sometimes they identify themselves with the Paramatma, which of course is an aparad, which keeps them from going any further. And then sometimes they try to merge, instead of merging into the effulgence, they try to merge actually into the body of the Paramatma, which is said to be worse than merging into the effulgence. So there's different kinds of practitioners with different levels of knowledge. But the people who become familiar with devotional service and bhakti yoga, they understand that the supreme goal is Bhagavan, and that the permanent situation is in the spiritual world, where one has an eternal relationship with the Supreme Lord in one of 5 rasas, which are called Shanta, neutrality, Dasya, servitude, Sakya, friendship, Vatsalya, parental affection, and Madhurya, conjugal love. And one has such a relationship with one of the forms of the Supreme Lord. There's many different forms of the Lord, like we worship Krishna, and there's Rama, and there's Sringa. And they all have their different planets in the spiritual world, and every individual soul has a particular rasa with a particular form of the Supreme Person. And then in our Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya, we promote the worship of Krishna. We understand the form of Krishna is superior to the other forms because it's the original form. It's the source of all others. And Jiva Goswami highlights the verse 1:328 of the Bhāgavatam. Ete changsa kalapungsam ete changsa kalapungsam Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam Indriyaya Vakalam Lokam Mridayanti Yuge Yuge. After this whole list of about 18 avatars or something like that, there's a statement that all these avatars are portions, plenty parts or parts of or portions of the part of the Supreme Lord Krishna, but Krishna is Svayam Bhagavan, the original personality. So Lord Chaitanya would always promote the worship of Krishna, and occasionally he would run into somebody who was so attached to Lord Ramachandra that they wouldn't be able to accept the worship of Krishna. And then he would praise them, saying that that was perfectly okay. In the case of Murari Gupta, he said, that's not surprising because you're actually an incarnation of Hanuman, and therefore it's befitting you. So basically, people in human society, they don't know that there's three different kinds of pleasure, as mentioned by the Rupa Goswami and Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. There's the material pleasure, and there's a pleasure of understanding oneself to be spirit and one with the Supreme Spirit. And then there's the pleasure derived from devotional service to Krishna, the devotional pleasure. And that devotional pleasure is highest. And then he quotes some verses in that section that's saying that it's like thousands of times greater than even one little bit of bhakti is like thousands of times greater than the pleasure of merging into the absolute truth, and that pleasure is greater than the material pleasure. So people are in ignorance of this transcendental knowledge, so they just endeavor for material happiness, and because their minds are filled with material desires at the time of death, they have to take another material body. But this purport speaks about how these mystics and transcendentalists, they cross beyond birth and death by ceasing all material desires. So what we're on is the path of nirvritti marga, where we're trying to decrease our material desires. And the practitioners of bhakti decrease their material desires by increasing their spiritual desires, so that their material desires get ideally just forgotten about, because they have such, they just have a better time engaging in the devotional service of the Lord than they did doing anything else. And they gradually decrease their material desires to an amazing extent, actually, because we have these people who eat a little bit of buttermilk every second day and only sleep 2 hours, and because they're so absorbed in their devotional service to Krishna, they actually practically give up all interest in their material body, which is actually possible if somebody is completely absorbed. So it's the mercy of the Lord that one can actually be engaged in this devotional service, and basically He manifests His mercy by sending His devotees all over the world to share His message with other people. He comes Himself, but He comes very rarely. There's how many avatars are listed in the Bhāgavatam, and how many millions of years does the Bhāgavatam cover? How many kalpas and mahakalpas? So the Lord comes rarely. Usually He manifests His mercy by providing the revealed literature and by sending the pure devotees to travel all over the world sharing this knowledge with people, so that they have the opportunity to cross beyond this nations. So the Lord has most recently incarnated as Lord Chaitanya and His expansion Nityananda, and they've made this bhakti very accessible by widely preaching the Sankirtan of the holy name, which is Cheto Darpana Marjanam. It cleanses the mirror of the heart. It cleanses the heart of people from their material desires. I was proofreading this book. One devotee wrote about Prabhupada traveling to South India, and he had different quotes from Prabhupada's lectures that he gave in different places like Hyderabad. And I noticed he kept quoting this Cheto-darpana. So I decided I would look it up on the folio. How many times does Prabhupada say Cheto-darpana? It's like 553 times, But that was something that really meant a lot to Prabhupada, that this congregational chanting it's the thing that's cleansing the mirror of the mind. And therefore, he wanted the devotees to go out on Harinam every day so that the people would have an opportunity to have their minds cleansed. Because their material existence exists because of these material desires. But the more they hear the holy name, the more they're purified from material contamination. Actually, the difference between us and the people in general is we've just heard the holy name more than they have. And the more they hear it, the more purified they become. Of course, the people who want to become purified, they appreciate it more. And people have different levels of consciousness. Some people can actually appreciate. Like I was saying that one time I went to Tompkins Square Park and I played my harmonium. And after 20 minutes, somebody came up to me and said, "Thank you for cleaning the air by your singing." Right? So this was just some ordinary 50-year-old guy sitting on a bench reading some book, and he comes up and said, "Thank you for cleaning the air by your singing." So he appreciated some cleansing was happening, which is very rare. And then at the Times Square one time, we were singing in the subway above the 7 train. This lady walked by, and she was like smiling the whole time she was looking at the kirtan party. So I said, "Do you have some connection with this?" She seemed like, "I just heard some people singing at Union Square, that's all." And I said, "Oh, actually, we're the same people. We just sing here when it gets cold." And I said, "Well, it seems like you seem to like the chanting." And she said, "That sound is pure joy." So that's an amazing realization. When we know Krishna, as we say in the Damodar prayers, we start right off the bat, Namami Shram Satchidananda, right? Rupam. He's eternal, he's full of bliss, and he's full of knowledge, and he's manifested as his name. So the name itself is Ananda, it's spiritual bliss. But how many people actually hear the spiritual bliss when they walk by the Harinam party? A few, because of their past devotional activities. They're blessed. So, the Supreme Lord is desiring that we cross beyond this nations, because actually there's many times that Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita says this one phrase. It comes up several times in the end of a verse. Tato yanti param gatim. And it comes in innumerable places. One place where Prabhupada quotes it is at the end of the verse, talking about how it doesn't matter whether you're a woman, Vaishya, Shudra, whatever you are, if you take shelter of him, you attain the supreme destination. So there's many verses where he talks about coming back to him, because that's basically, he doesn't like to see his praja, his offspring, suffering in any way. In any material situation on the lower planets, the middle planets, or the higher planets, they're all full of misery, as he describes. So he's always making this propaganda to go back to Godhead. And he stresses the this bhakti 3 times. Prabhupada always quoted that verse, Bhakti mama vijanati yavanyas jasmi tatvada tattvato gyatva vishate tada antaram. I can be known as I am only by devotional service, and when one is in full consciousness of me by such devotion, he can enter into the kingdom of God. But actually, there's some verses, there's 2 other verses that promote bhakti in a big way. And one of the more quoted one is 1154. Bhaktya tvananya shaka ame varvadorjuna yatam drastam cha tatvena pravesham cha parantapa. My dear Arjuna, only by undivided devotional service can I be understood as I am, standing before you, and can thus be seen directly. Only in this way can you enter into the mysteries of my understanding. So that adds another qualifying factor, not just bhaktya, but ananyaya bhaktya. Bhakti that's not, anya means another. So ananya means no other. And ananyaya means by no other. So by no other means than this unalloyed bhakti is it possible. And that idea of unalloyed bhakti is also mentioned in a verse that is very rarely quoted, 822. Purusha sapara partha bhaktya labas tvananyaya yasyantas tani bhutani yena sarvamitam tatam. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is greater than all, is attainable by unalloyed devotion. Although he is present in his abode, he is all-pervading, and everything is situated within him. So here, Krishna is mentioning it from the 3rd person, the Supreme Personality. He's attainable by unalloyed devotion. And the other verse he says, I'm attainable by unalloyed devotion. So, basically meaning that he and the Supreme Personality are the same. So this is the way people attain the supreme abode is by performing the bhakti. They get the mercy of the Lord, and they get the idea how to perform the bhakti from the bhakta who has the mercy. And therefore we sing this every morning. We sing Yasya prasadad bhagavat prasado Yasya prasada nagati kutopi. So one who gets the mercy by the mercy of the spiritual master, he gets the mercy of the Lord. And one who does not get the mercy of the spiritual master, nagati kutopi, which basically means his destination is unknown. He may go to the lower planets, the middle planets, or the upper planets, but he won't get the mercy of the Lord and go to the supreme abode. So there's 11 minutes left for questions, comments, realizations. Do you have any additional things you'd like to say about this?
Actually working? Oh yeah, it's actually working today. Good. This verse, I was thinking, it's interesting that all these different groups are called yogis. You know, I was noticing that in the verse, and also the way Prabhupada explains it in the purports. And then that made me realize just today that the word yoga is also one of those Sanskrit buzzwords that can mean a number of different things depending on the context. You know, like karma yoga or varnashram dharma or jnana. You know, it can mean things that are very different in some ways. But what's interesting is that this really reminded me, because we're doing the Bhakti Shastri class, you know, right now, and we're on the first 6 chapters of Bhagavad Gita, and in chapter 4, Krishna describes a whole group of different kinds of yogis. You know, he talks about this is starting with verse 425. You know, some yogis perfectly worship the demigods by offering different sacrifices to them, and some offer sacrifices in the fire of the Supreme Brahman. So this is very much paraphrasing what we're hearing in Bhāgavatam.
Yeah, it's true.
Then some, the unadulterated brahmacharis, sacrifice the hearing process and the senses in the fire of mental control, and others, the regulated householders, sacrifice the objects of the senses in the fire of the senses. Then we have others who are interested in achieving self-realization through control of the mind and senses, offer the function of all the senses and of the life breath as oblations into the fire of the controlled mind. So, having accepted strict vows, some have become enlightened by sacrificing their possessions, and others by performing severe austerities, by practicing the yoga of eightfold mysticism, or by studying the Vedas to advance in transcendental knowledge. Still others who are inclined to the process of breath restraint to remain in trance practice the offering of the movement of the outgoing breath into the incoming and the incoming breath into the outgoing, and thus at last remain in trance, stopping all breathing. Others, curtailing the eating process, offer the outgoing breath into itself as a sacrifice. So it's interesting, all these. There's kind of a redundancy here to some extent, but all of them are called yogis. And then in the 6th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, Karmibhyo, what is it? Tapasvibhyo diko yogi, Jnanibhyo pimato dikaha.
Karmibhyaschadiko yogi. Karmibhyaschadiko
yogi. Tasma yogi vivarjana. Krishna there is actually making distinction between these other groups and the yogis. He's telling Arjuna he should be a yogi. So previously he's kind of classing those as types of yogis, and now he's making distinction between those, and he's telling Arjuna to be a yogi, but he's not wanting Arjuna to become a meditator yogi. He wants him to be, a different kind of yogi, as we hear, he says, what is it? Now the verse has slipped my mind. Let me go there real quick. Yogi namapi sarvesha madhite mantaratmana shradabam bhajite yomam same tatamo mataha. So the best kind of yogi is one who always thinks of me, engages in my devotional service, So this is the kind of yogi Krishna is actually asking Arjuna to be. And of course this is a description of, as we know, a bhakti yogi. Because no mention is there of meditation, no mention is there of, breath restraint, or no mention is there of curtailing all the activity of all the senses. So therefore the kind of yogi Krishna wants Arjuna to be is a bhakti yogi. So these different kinds of categories of action are all yoga in the sense of we're uniting with something, or it's a mystical process. So partly yoga indicates mystical process. It's interesting that actually even yoga can mean trick.
I was just looking up, and there's like 25 meaning. Actually, there's like 30 meanings for yoga.
Right. It's very prolific word, as far as various nuances are there. There's one point where Duryodhan says that when Krishna manifests all the demigods from his body in his universal form to avoid being captured by Duryodhan's men, Duryodhan replied that this was some yoga by Krishna, meaning it was a trick.
Oh, I see.
It was some kind of mystical display only. But at any rate, it seems like yoga means some kind of mystic path. So certainly the jnanis are a mystic path, the karmis are a mystic path. As we see, there's all kinds of other mystic paths, doing tapasya, in engaging in worshiping demigods. All these are mystic paths, and in that sense, they're all yogis. But then more, we think of the word yoga as meditation. But that's not really the only meaning of yoga. We can see that yoga also means to unite with what? Or in the sense of yoga meaning to connect with Krishna specifically. And that's what the bhakti yogi is. That's where we get yogi namapi sarvesha bhakti-namparatmana shadavam bhajatayo mamaso sameya yutattamo mataha. I just thought I'd throw that in because it was kind of in the same.
Yeah, it's true. You're quite right about that. Yeah, that first verse goes, Daivam eva preya yami yogina paripaste. These yogis worshiping the demigods. After all those different kinds of practices you mentioned is the 4:30. All these performers who know the meaning of sacrifice become cleansed of sinful reaction and have tasted the nectar of the results of sacrifice. They advance toward the supreme eternal atmosphere. So it seems like they all advance toward the spiritual direction, but some make it further than others, basically.
And it seems like, at least as far as chapter 4 of Bhagavad Gita goes, there's this concept that these various sacrifices of these yogis, their goal is knowledge. And I assume what Krishna's meaning there is knowledge of him as the center of the universe and the purpose of all activity. That kind of knowledge, not mundane jnana, but bhakti jnana. So that's what we're gaining by doing these sacrifices. So if someone's not actually able or ready to accept Krishna consciousness, if they perform one of these other activities, it kind of heads them in that direction, although they won't necessarily get there unless a devotee inspires them to take up directly Krishna consciousness. But through various kinds of these types of sacrifices, one gets knowledge, and then when one gets knowledge, one gets the understanding that we should engage in devotional service, which is ultimately the culmination of it all.
Yeah, and that's all supported by the Bhagavad Gita, where it says, because in 33 he says, the sacrifice performed in knowledge is better than the mere sacrifice of possessions. After all sacrifices of work culminate in transcendental knowledge. And then, after telling one to get the knowledge from a guru, he says, having attained real knowledge from a self-realized soul, you'll never fall into such illusion, for by this knowledge you will see that all living beings are but part of the Supreme, or in other words, that they are mine. So that the knowledge that you're getting from the sacrifices is that all living creatures are part of Krishna, and they're actually Krishna's. Yeah. Or
at least to make an effort to act in it.
Yeah, and the next verse is pretty good. It says, even if you're considered to be the most sinful of all sinners, when you're situated in the boat of transcendental knowledge, you'll be able to cross over the ocean of miseries. So if you actually identify yourself as being part of Krishna and you actually serve Krishna, even if you've been a rascal your whole life, if just the rest of your life you serve Krishna, then you got it made. Well, it's exactly 9 o'clock, so I guess, okay.
So, but how do we understand, like, you're talking about all these people, different yogis, and it says that they understand the importance of sacrifice, right? So how do we understand the importance of sacrifice? Because as obviously these people doing, these kind of yogis, doing this very mystical processes, they do it in full consciousness, otherwise they won't be able to do it. But what is our position being brought to this the highest process that leads to the highest regions of the spiritual world, but then if we act without putting our consciousness, without understanding the importance, as we act on autopilot sometimes. And like, how do we realize the importance of
the
sacrifice?
idea is that like part of our sadhana is to read Srila Prabhupada's books, and then if we read Bhagavad Gita, this whole section, this in the previous chapter 3, there's that verse that you have to memorize if you take the Bhakti Shastri 3:9, Yagnartat Kamano Yaktra Yokolam Yam Karabandam Tadartam Apikonteya Mukta Sangha Samatra. That work must be done as sacrifice to Vishnu, otherwise work binds one to this material world. Therefore, perform your duty for his satisfaction and become free from bondage. So that's the whole thing is, and the one after that, which is 3:10, actually talks about how the Lord of all creatures sent forth sacrifices for Vishnu, and generations of men and demigods, along with sacrifices for Vishnu, and blessed them by saying, "Be thou happy by this yajna or sacrifice, because its performance will bestow upon you everything desirable for living happily and achieving liberation." And then from that section that we were just reading, 431, which is the one after the one about advancing toward the supreme eternal atmosphere. O best of the Kuru dynasty, without sacrifice, one can never live happily on this planet or in this life. What to speak of the next? So it's like, it's such a theme that basically we've misappropriated the property of the Supreme Lord, considering that it's ours, and we perform sacrifice by engaging in His service again, and this way we become free from our material contamination. It's a theme. Mm.
That there's kind of sacrifice, giving up some of what you have or what your resources are, in a general sort of way.
Mm.
And then there's giving up some of your resources directly to the Supreme Person,
Right.
a higher version, and that we get in the 12th chapter.
Mm.
That when one is giving up directly to the Supreme Lord, that's considered devotional service.
Mm.
Whereas if one cannot perform the second circle out, the first circle is always thinking, the second
Mm.
circle is engaged in the practice of devotional service in this way that one desires to. Third circle is work,
Mm.
sacrifice, of course, but not necessarily engaging in any sadhana particularly. And then if you can't do that, then the next circle out is just surrender, usually letting some extent, some kind of further circle out.
Mm. Yeah, that's also like there in 247 he says Kamani Vadi Karastema Palishu Kadachanama Karma Palahetu Buru Ma Te Sangro Shakamani. You have a right to perform your prescribed duty, but you're not entitled to the fruits of action. But later on he talks about that the fruits action should be offered to Him. There's verses like Yat Karoshi, Yat Ashnashi, Yat Josi, whatever you do, whatever you sacrifice, you should do it for me. So there he just says you shouldn't consider it's yours, but what you should actually do with it is to give it to Him. And some people, I was at one place where there was some Indian people, and he thought he knew the Bhagavad Gita, and that was the verse he quoted. It just says, be detached from the results, but it didn't. I said, well, that's not the ultimate conclusion. The ultimate conclusion is to engage the results in Krishna service. That's just the beginning.
That seems to be the beginning of the spiritual journey for some people, in recognizing explicitly says that in whatever it is. I think it's 12:12. That in the purport, Prabhupada describes that you give it up to some good cause. It's not devotional service anymore,
Right.
but it's kind of in the penumbra of devotional service.
It's a kind of sacrifice.
It's close. And if someone does that long enough, they may come in contact with devotees, and that may bridge the gap from a pious activity, which will gain some good karma in the future, to actual devotional service, which is akarma, and winds somebody up from their sojourn in the material cycle of reincarnation.
That reminds me, there's a purport in the Gita where Prabhupada says if one decides to sacrifice for the supreme cause, that if he does, not knowing that the supreme cause is Krishna, by that sacrifice he will come to realize the supreme cause is Krishna. Yeah.
It's obvious some demigod worshippers are specifically sacrificing for something that's not Krishna.
Yeah.
Or maybe those who are altruistic, they're sacrificing for the cause of mankind or something like that, something much more vague, or something that's actually not the supreme cause. But still, because they're sacrificing, it sort of pulls you in the right direction and offers you the chance to be in association with those who do know what the real cause is, and might, switch your allegiance or thinking.
Thank you for...
Last question after this. So does that mean that by performing sacrifice, we are reforming our consciousness to act selfishly? Selflessly.
Yeah, we're practicing selfless action, yeah.
And it's destroying sin. Sacrifice one destroys sin, and by sacrifice one is reforming, as you said, the selfish nature of the false ego. We're getting rid of that to some extent, and that opens one up to bhakti. Doesn't necessarily guarantee bhakti, but opens one up to bhakti.
And that's supported by that statement 430, where Krishna says all these performers who know the meaning of sacrifice become cleansed of sinful reactions, and having tasted the nectar of the results of sacrifice, they advance toward the supreme eternal atmosphere. Yeah, 430. 430. It's the one after those ones you read, yeah.
That always seemed to be a very mysterious section. Where Krishna lists all these kind of like miscellaneous and sundry things people are doing.
Yeah, it's sort of like a Hindu hodgepodge thing.
But evidently, Krishna is just kind of doing a summarization of various kinds of Vedic practices, which can be classed as yajna. And this yajna is yajna, in some cases, done with some actual knowledge, and in some cases not. In some cases, that yajna is done to the Supreme, in some cases not. It's also interesting that this yajna is connected with yoga.
Right. So I guess we can end now, because it's definitely past 9 o'clock. Thank you for your contributions. Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai.